Oh, that's the. Okay. All right, thank you, sir. Hold on just a second. Okay. I'll try on the. I don't know. This gentleman came and tried to get me on Google Hangouts.
This was a thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I would just start.
Yeah, I can't get this thing off my screen.
I hang out with.
Yeah, that one password.
Okay. You want me to go try to look for some?
Yeah, if you can. So I'm going to get started. Having some display difficulties. Someone came and helped me get this set up on Google Hangouts, and now I can't get this one password window off of my display. And hopefully someone will come and help us with this. I'd like to welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to be discussing identity, authentication, and authorization. These three concepts, some would say, are fundamental to the world of IT and web security. They're also very key to all aspects of usability. No one can get anywhere if they can't log into the website. So we have to manage these entities with the right rigor and balance so that the legitimate users in the public interest can get the key resources and services they need, while we also have protection requisite with the level of risk we're managing for keeping illegitimate users out and avoiding other types of compromises. Once again, I'm Mike Nescott. I am Web Operations Manager. Oh yeah, I'm trying to get this thing off the screen. Window here. Thank you. Like this. Oh. Participants in the Drupal community. So I say I'm Mike Nescott, but my official documentation says I'm Michael Alexander Nescott. I can't put my license up there, or my PIV card. This is Mike Nescott. This is Mike Nescott with our team at the recent DrupalCon Austin. This is Mike Nescott as an open source web development expert at the recent JBS Halloween party. So like many of us, I have many different manifestations of my physical identity based on the situation and the context. True, like most of us, for my virtual identity. I'm M. Nescott on most of the leading social networks to maintain consistency, transparency, and also just to remember who I am. But many of us have usernames that differ tremendously from our physical names, and some of us have different accounts on the same network for our personal and our business work because, let's say, our aunt doesn't really care that much about physical. With the multitude of identities growing online as social networks evolve, the task of managing our identities becomes increasingly challenging. And the challenge of having our web applications make the correct decisions about whether to let someone in with such a complex identity based on the credentials and the information they present also becomes increasingly challenging. Before considering how Drupal can help us adapt to this type of complexity, let's take a step back and look at some of the simple concepts in the world of authorization, authentication, and identity, often known in the federal realm as ICANN, Identity, Credential, and Access Management. Identity can be simply defined as the set of unique characteristics that distinguish us from others. An identifier is simply our identity when we used it for identification. And we've all already discussed that we often can distinguish between our physical and virtual identity, but there's often a relationship as well, where our virtual identity includes aspects of our physical identity together with our information, let's say, on our online behavior. Authentication can be considered the process of determining whether we are who we say we are. And on the online world, it's generally the process of establishing confidence in the identity of the users of an information system. may have certain privileges on a website, let's say. Typically, when you are authenticating to a web application, you're using something you have, such as a PIV card. Electronic grip, also known as a biometric. Increasingly, it's becoming common to use multiple forms of authentication together, which is known as multi-step or multi-factor authentication. And when we look at the use of authentication tokens in methods of authentication, we see there are actually subtypes and some complexity underlying these three basic types. But we also on the web server can use basic authentication, NTML, or digest authentication, with hands-off authentication to the web server. All of these can be secured by SSL. It's also important to note that it's often not the password itself that's being used in authentication. It's the output of the password going through some type of hashing algorithm. Besides passwords, we also have different types of user certificates and tokens maintained in hardware or software. We talked about biometrics, which are currently not widely used on the web for authentication, but they may be someday. Besides fingerprints, you can imagine the use of face recognition, voice recognition. And two trends in authentication are actually considering two factors which may be considered secondary authentication factors. This is known as risk and attribute-based authentication, and this basically looks at the logical constraints and the characteristics of the behavior you're exhibiting when you're logging in, and using this to determine whether perhaps you should reject an authentication. Even though you issued the correct password, you're maybe logging in for the first time from South America when you just logged out 5 minutes ago in Gaithersburg. That sort of thing raises an alarm and increasingly can be used more intelligently to dynamically make the correct authentication decision on the web. Authorization is generally the process of determining whether you have permission to do with the object you're trying to do something with. Do you have permission as a site editor to add users to the site, to delete the post you're trying to delete? In IT, we often talk about three major types of access control systems underlying authorization. There's mandatory access control MAC, which is commonly used in the military. Often is based on different levels of information, top secret, for example. We have discretionary access control, which uses ACLs, commonly used in file systems like Windows. Do you have access to someone else's home directory, for example? And in Drupal on the web, we're generally dealing with what is known as role-based access control, where the Drupal users are organized into groups. Those groups are known as roles, and they're given specific permissions. And role-based access control is basically enforced for a session. So if you're logged in as an administrator for this session, then you have the privileges necessary to add or delete users, let's say, or post stuff to the site. It's also important increasingly to distinguish between user access control and application access control. In the social web, we're increasingly seeing situations where we as users of a website are actually granting authorization of that website, let's say, to post to our Twitter accounts. So it's becoming, authorization and access control itself is becoming more complex. Drupal gives us a generally granular, flexible set of permissions for each module that allow us to precisely define what you can do for each content type and each type of entity. And with each module, it can become cumbersome to manage this. As we add more modules to the site, as we add more content types, there are, fortunately, a number of access control modules which can help make this process easier and more manageable in the long run. At JBS, we make a lot of use of the Workbench Access module, as we deal a lot with content approval workflows. The whole Workbench suite is very well attuned to manage that type of situation. Credentials across multiple sites. We log into a web browser to their accounts in Drupal maintained in a database, but rather we'll be dealing with a complex ICANN model where we have, let's say, users logging in with a smart watch attached to a smartphone that is accessing the website through some type of service and application. They may be authorizing the site to post account. We may have other administrators, let's say, logging into the site whose accounts are maintained in our central corporate directory or at a corporate directory of a trusted partner, let's say. This model of complex ICANN, although it involves many more protocols and data flows, hopefully has the promise of actually providing us the ability to more simply manage our identities and our web applications at the growing scale that the web has reached. Although many aspects of this transformation are rather recent, many of the essential tenets of ICAM actually go back quite a ways to the mid-2000s, when NIST and OMB issued some of the very important e-authentication guidance. Around the same time, there's a gentleman named Descartes who was raising public attention on a concept known as Identity 2.0. This is in the Web 2.0 era, those of you who remember that. And he was trying to focus on the importance of being able to use the same credentials at different websites, while at the same time being able to protect our personal data and control our identities. A gentleman named Kim Cameron, along the same lines, came up with a set of laws of identity, which again advocated that we needed to have a world on the web where it was easier to use the same account at different locations and still be able to have confidence that before your information was accessed, you were going to be giving specific authorization for that type of access. So the federal guidance in that era came in the form of OMB Memorandum 0404, and that was described the general need for e-authentication standards in the federal government. NIST in document 800-63.2 issues specific guidelines for e-authentication. This document has been updated several times over the years, most recently last August. And this document, like most of the other NIST security requirements, set forth a risk-based approach to deciding what types of controls you needed for e-authentication, what types of technologies you needed to authenticate users to your website. The idea being that the higher the level of risk you were facing, the more stringent and refined the system you needed to. This document also technologies for e-authentication you needed. Type of e-authentication error, such as a breach on your site. You can see that there's a need for increasing stringency in terms of e-authentication. Level 4, we need a very high requirement in terms of level of assurance. We need some technologies such as a PIV card. We note that at levels 3 and 4, we have a requirement for actually having valid legal names. Levels 1 and 2, we can use pseudonyms on our website. In other words, you can just register an account, as John Smith, and there does not need to be any requirement that that's your actual name. NIST also developed a more elaborate set of authentication token types that in many ways correspond to the 3 types we looked at earlier. But you'll note that although there is reference to basically what is a password, is a knowledge token, and different types of forms of what you have in terms of token, there is no means of biometrics in this list here. NIST, in the current standard, does not consider biometrics to be a reliable means of authentication. There's a more detailed look at the different types of tokens that you can use at different levels of assurance. And there's a more succinct summary matrix from NIST about the different types of tokens you can use at different levels. For example, at level 2, we need some type of strong password. Again, at level 3, we need a 1-password device. When we get to level 4, we need some type of hardware token, such as a PIV card. The model provided authentication model included in the guidance that specified certain types of roles in the e-authentication process. You have subscribers, which is basically the users. You have the credential service identities, the accounts. And then we have the authentication to actually grant access to the user. These last 3 roles are in many cases actually fulfilled by the same party, but they were split up partially in anticipation of the type of distributed web we have in place today, where it's increasingly possible that different parties may perform different functions among this list. There's a diagram of the participants in this model and how they interact. It's important to note that when we talked about a general level of assurance the system needs to satisfy, there's attached to each one of these data flows, so that in order to have a level 3 system, you have to have a level 3 registration process. You can't have a very stringent authentication mechanism and then have a very lax way of having people sign up for the system. Moving ahead to 1986, that was when the FICAM program was actually initiated and is managed by GSA. Okay, and among the major programs under FICAM is the HSPD initiative. Credentials and identifying materials used across. And this is a chart that shows the current status of implementation of the HSPD PIV identification across different agencies. The ultimate goal being that every place in the federal government. In many cases, this can be reviewed as restricting the scope of authentication also been instrumental in recognizing the long-term scope of FICAM and authentication technologies. For example, FICAM is cited as a major building block in information sharing program focused on having the federal government sharing and acting upon national security data. And FICAM is also what is known as the Open Identity Exchange. It was actually launched as an initiative of the federal government. It's a nonprofit corporation. The idea, as is depicted on this picture, that it becomes increasingly easy for someone to use their Google account to log into a service, actually with fairly or NLM or the Library of Congress or other federal agencies. If we take a look at briefly some of the technologies and protocols that we can use to implement the type of federation model we just looked at. Here are some of the prominent ones. SAML, OAuth, and OpenID are major authentication federation protocols. CAS and Shibboleth are open source servers that also first two, allowing people to to federate with other authentication mechanisms using different types of protocols to advance standards. Is a commercial SAML. It's a use at NIH. And then there are, as we see in this last bullet point, emerging more types of open source identity servers that provide a means of actually spinning up your own authentication, a federation that would be using these types of technologies. Across these different technologies and protocols, there's a model that includes some common roles and participants. There's typically a user, a set of resources that user is trying to access or provide access to. There's identity provider, which holds the account, and the service providers, which are relying on the claims that come from the identity provider that they should give access to the user according to the credentials. And looking back to that set of protocols, there's a lot of actually discussion currently about the differences between SAML 2 and OAuth 2. More and more these are being viewed as the leading federated authentication and authorization protocols. SAML 2 provides a fairly easy means of federating authentication with another party using XML messages and certificates. It's been around since 2005. It's been widely adopted in government and in big industries. It does have the disadvantage of using XML, which is rather bloated and does not perform well on mobile devices. There's been an increasing, many of us know, movement to more compact message formats such as JSON. This is a comparison attribute, and you can imagine on a mobile device multiplying this, in a message affects performance. JSON is the protocol that is used in OAuth. And so partly as a result of that, also partly as a result of it being relatively easy to use for developers, in the last several years it's gained widespread adoption, faster than basically any other technology that has been used in the attempt to federate and share access over the years. Now, another important development actually builds on the flexibility of the fact that the specification model that's now been standardized, something known as OpenID Connect. This has been gained widespread traction, even though the formal specification was only released earlier this year. You may have noticed in the last several years the increasing number of sites in which you're given the opportunity to sign in with your Google or Facebook account, and this its recent widespread adoption of Rapid Advance. There's been a whole set of cryptographic protocols developed that allow you to securely transmit OAuth messages from end to end. And this has led to the hope that and sharing of identities in the web world will soon even expand further as this OAuth to OpenID suite becomes more accepted in highly secure environments. The FICAM program, which we discussed earlier, insurance ratings that we discussed before. You'll note that there are a number of level 2 service providers that use SAML. OpenID Connect, OAuth 2 is relatively new. It's not been assessed yet, but there's some who say that it's very possible that this type of model, if depending on how it's implemented by the company or other provider who uses it, may also be capable of achieving level 3 assurance, which would again lead to more opportunities to collaborate across different identity providers online. There's another initiative in the federal government to federate identity and authentication that's worth mentioning. It comes from what is known as NISTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, which has led to the creation, just launched this year, of what is known as the Federal Cloud Credential Exchange. And this basically will provide a federal identity service, if you will, that will allow you to, again, through another type of model, sign in with Exchange in the next couple of years. Let's finally get around to seeing how Drupal specifically can help us deal with some of the opportunities and the challenges and the requirements that this type of transformation is bringing along. We looked a little bit at the core capabilities of Drupal and authentication and authorization and access control a little bit before. And there are more than 800 other modules that can help us augment our application to use some of the technologies and satisfy some of the requirements we just looked at. We'll just take a look at a few of those, including the password policy, LDAP, Simple SAML PHP, Hybrid Auth, and Google Authenticator modules. We saw that even at level 2 level of assurance, there's a requirement that you have a strong password by default. Drupal allows you to use password as password, being a flexible CMS. But the password policy model readily enforce the types of password expiration and complexity requirements that you need for a very stringent system. The LDAP module allows a range of options for integrating your authentication technology with different central directories, implementing variants of the LDAP model, including Active Directory. You can simply authorize users or authenticate users. You can tie in LDAP groups, associate those with Drupal roles, and you can even use the Drupal application as a means of registering or creating users in LDAP. The Simple SAML PHP module is something we used at JBS to support federation with Drupal web applications and the directories such as the net directory here at NIH. It integrates with that SiteMinder solution we discussed. It builds on top of a PHP library called Simple SAML PHP. And most of the configuration in terms of the XML messages, metadata, and the certificates, most of the configuration is actually done in this library. And then you do the final stages of configuration in the Drupal module and establish the And this is a screenshot of a site using that module to enable PivCard authentication with a net directory at NIH. Hybrid Auth model, we discussed OAuth 2. Behind the scenes, this module uses OAuth 2 as an underlying layer and other technologies to allow you to allow users to authenticate to a Drupal site with a wide variety of external providers, including Google, Facebook, Yahoo, GitHub, and many others. The key step to configuring and enabling this module is registering for an API key and account with one of these providers, and then implementing it, configuring it within Drupal. And take a brief look at the Google Authenticator, which provides a relatively cost-effective and easy way of rolling out your own two-factor authentication solution based on the one-time password token model. Many of you may have seen the tokens that provide your one-time password codes. These traditionally have been very expensive from a hardware and licensing perspective. And it's important to point out that although it's called Google Authenticator, It's not dependent at all on Google services or restricted to Google services. It refers to an application ecosystem that was built on Google based on an community effort called OAuth, which is different from the OAuth people that developed the authentication protocols and authorization protocols. And this basically, when you enable this module, allows a user visiting your site to produce a barcode or a key that they then register with a device on their mobile phone. It can be Windows, BlackBerry, iOS, and Android, or a desktop application. There's a Chrome extension, and then after the registration with the server is finalized, if they choose, there's two types of protocols that are possible with this module. There's what is known as a time-based token algorithm, which will issue a different code periodically, and generally every minute. So every minute, a new code will appear on your phone, or based on counters. So you'll click a button to get the next code. Then, when logging in, as an additional step of verification and protection, you'll have to enter this code into that application to establish a connection to the server. Just like to wrap up by taking a look at the what we can anticipate in terms of technologies like authentication and federation when it comes to Drupal 8. And a number of the modules that we already looked at have Drupal 8 versions already in some stage of development. I think very importantly, Drupal 8 also has implemented a pluggable authentication module, which allows you to readily develop your own, what is known as authentication manager, and plug that into the system, providing your own custom authentication provider. So I'd just like to wrap things up by accounts to securely authenticate users, and just of the increasingly complex identity situation. And I think hopefully we've looked at some of the ways in which Drupal can help us become more mature from an identity management perspective in the future. With that, I'd like to thank you and open up the forum for any questions anyone may have. Yes?
The acronym for the White House study, what that slide, what was the FE? It was one of the slides that showed a picture of the front of the White House study, or at the bottom?
It was actually, yes, that was the NISTIG initiative, the documentation on the NISTIG initiative. I'll include that URL along with my Any other questions?
You said you might distribute your PowerPoint?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Should I email you for it?
That's true.
Thank you. Will you put it up on the session?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else?